Paul Tudor Jones and the crazy inflation ahead. In this video, I'll be sharing with you my full breakdown of Paul Tudor Jones' CNBC interview where he talked about the topic of inflation. And if you stick till the end of the video, I'll be sharing with you the exact inflation trades that Paul Tudor Jones himself is looking at currently. These are the exact trades that Paul Tudor Jones is looking at to generate returns in an inflationary environment, which he believes that we are currently experiencing right now. Let's first watch a clip of Paul Tudor Jones' interview on CNBC and his thoughts on inflation.
The idea that inflation is transitory, to me, is that one just doesn't work the way I see the world.
So in the clip earlier on that you have just watched, Paul Tudor Jones believes that inflation is real and is material, and it's not some transitory thing that the Fed make it out to be. In fact, Paul Tudor Jones even mentioned that he believed that the Fed is not being sincere with regards to their views on inflation. And the Fed is just playing down inflation as being transitory in nature because they're solely focused on a single mandate right now, which is maximizing employment. Paul Tudor Jones brought up this example back in 2013 on how the Fed reacted to inflation levels back in 2013 versus inflation level that we are currently seeing right now in 2021. This is a transcript from Paul Tudor Jones' interview on CNBC. So he used the example in 2013. He mentioned that in 2013, when the Fed first began to talk about taper, inflation was 1.5%, and inflation was measured based on the CPI data, which was 1.5%. And he contrasts this with the 4.9% that we are currently seeing in 2021. And he brings on the point that if we look at both inflation, which is much greater today than it was back then in 2013, the Fed in 2013 was concerned enough about inflation, but contrast this in 2021. The Fed is much more lax about its view on inflation. In 2013, with roughly the same numbers, the Fed was looking to begin to taper. But in 2021, not only is the Fed not looking to taper, they actually brush off inflation as being transitory in nature. So as we can see over here, Paul Tudor Jones' view on inflation is very different from the view of inflation by the Fed. And he even mentioned that the Fed's current mandate, which is to maximize employment, is too narrow in vision. Because historically, the Fed has a dual mandate. It is price stability and reducing the number of unemployment or maximizing employment. But right now, Paul Tudor Jones believes that the Fed is too focused on one mandate, which is the maximizing of employment. And they are neglecting the other mandate, which is to have price stability. So this is Paul Tudor Jones' thoughts and opinions about inflation. So what is Paul Tudor Jones' next step of action in the markets? Let's watch this clip.
Okay, so here's the real question.
Right.
If things are bad as crazy right now, and you are a trader, not necessarily even a long-term investor, but a trader, let's just say you're thinking about where to put your money. I'd actually love to hear about it in the context of being a trader, but also actually as a long-term investor. What are you supposed to do in this environment?
Well, I'm going to watch the Fed on Wednesday. If they treat these numbers, which were material events, they're very material. If they treat them with nonchalance, then I think it's just a green light to bet heavily on every inflation trade. I'd have as many inflation hedges on as I possibly could.
So these are the three inflation trades that Paul Tudor Jones is looking at. The first is commodities, second Bitcoin, and the third is gold. For commodities, he briefly mentioned about the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index or GSCI and the Bloomberg Commodity Index. And I'd like to bring up this point that Paul Tudor Jones brought up in his CNBC interview when he talked about commodities.
So I'll look at $88 trillion of assets under management by asset managers. Of that, $670 billion are invested in commodity indices like Bloomberg Commodity Index, Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. That's about 0.75%. If I rewind just to 2011, when inflation was peaking at 3%, not CPI at 4.9, those same investors had 1.2% of their assets, which would imply today, if they just got back to weight, another $400 billion of buying in commodity indices. And if you certainly the impact models that we run would argue that GSEI or BCOM would double or triple. So you've got, if I just look at where asset managers are, 60-40 types, the one thing that they should be invested in, they're not invested in, probably because they're hearing these assurances that inflation's transitory. So you've got this massive short, really, in the commodity complex, a massive short there. So that makes me think that, and I'll look at the balances in a variety of commodities, and they're all so razor thin. They're all so razor thin. And this is just what happens if institutional money would get to where they should be, given the level of real rates. What happens if the Reddit crowd ever gets into commodities? God forbid if the bullies, the financial markets, ever were to take it on, for instance, like retail did back in the 70s.
Explain what you mean by that.
What I mean is that commodities are finite supply, small markets, generally speaking. And if we ever get an inflationary psychology, like, for instance, we did when I was in my 20s, back in the 70s, if we ever get that again, and if you ever got retail actually nervous about inflation, then the one thing that leads inflation, which is commodity prices, it's the easiest tautology there is. Those things can literally scream double or triple with no problem.
He mentions that currently around $670 billion out of $88 trillion worth of assets managed by asset managers are invested in commodities indexes. So that represented around 0.75% of total assets managed by these asset managers which are invested in commodities indexes. And he compared this against in 2011. In 2011, 1.2% of assets managed by asset managers were invested in commodity indexes. And back then, he mentions that the situation in 2011 was kind of similar to the situation that we are facing right now in 2021, especially with regards to inflation. So Paul Tudor Jones believes that many asset managers are currently underweighted in the commodity space. And the reason is because many of these asset managers continue to believe the fact that inflation is transitory in nature. And that is why they continue to remain underweight in the commodity indexes. But Paul Tudor Jones believes that when these asset managers realize that inflation is actually not transitory in nature as according to the Fed, if these asset managers allocate the same amounts of money towards commodities now as compared to 2011, he believes that commodities indexes will double or triple in value. Right, that is why commodities is one of Paul Tudor Jones' inflation trades. Paul Tudor Jones' second inflation trade is Bitcoin. He uses Bitcoin as a store of wealth and a portfolio diversifier. And the reason why he allocates some of his money towards Bitcoin is because, according to his own words, Bitcoin is reliable, consistent, honest, and 100% certain. And his view on Bitcoin does not just end there. He mentions how the Fed, monetary and fiscal policies, and even politicians tend to deviate a lot. So using the earlier example, he contrasted the Fed section in 2013 against the Fed section in 2021. And they were very different. And politicians also change over time, and so will their policies. Bitcoin reliable, consistent, honest, and 100% certain. And that is what makes Bitcoin an inflation trade for Paul Tudor Jones. So this was an explosive interview by Paul Tudor Jones on CNBC. What are your thoughts on inflation? Are you aligned with Paul Tudor Jones and believe that inflation is material and not transitory in nature? Or are you more aligned with the Fed who believes that inflation is transitory in nature? And if you are new to this channel and haven't already subscribed, make sure you subscribe to this channel so that you'll be the first to receive videos such as this in the future. I will see you in those other videos. To your financial success.